Welcome everybody. Thank you for coming. And my name is Anika. I'm part of MARS, Michigan Animal Rights Society. And to start off with, I was going to read the statement that PeterYoung had at court, and it's going to be a really good introduction for the rest of the talk. This is a customary time when the defendant expresses regret for the crimes they committed, so let me do that because I am not without my regrets. I am here today to be sentenced for my participation in releasing mink from 6 fur farms. I regret it was only 6. I am also here today to be sentenced for my participation in the freeing of 8,000 mink from those farms. I regret it was only 8,000. It is my understanding of those 6 farms, only 2 of them have since shut down. I regret it was only 2. More than anything, I regret my restraint, because whatever damage we did to those businesses, if those farms were left standing and if one animal was left behind, then it wasn't enough. I don't wish to validate this proceeding by begging for mercy or appealing to the conscience of the court, because I know if the system had a conscience, I would not be here, and in my place would be all the butchers, vivisectors, and fur farmers of the world. Just as I will remain unbowed before this court, who would see me in prison for an act of conscience, I will also deny the fur farmers in the room the pleasure of seeing me bow down before them. To those people whose sheds that I may have visited in 1997, let me tell you directly for the first time, it was a pleasure to raid your farms, and to free those animals you held captive. It is those animals I answer to, not you or this court. I will forever mark those nights on your property as the most rewarding experience of my life. And to those farmers or other savages who may read my words in the future and smile at my fate, just remember, we have put more of you in bankruptcy than you have put liberators in prison. Don't forget that. Let me thank everyone in the courtroom who came to support me today. It is my last wish before prison that each of you drive to a nearby fur farm tonight, tear down its fence, and open every cage. That's all. And you ready? And here's PeterYoung.
All right. Thank you. First of all, I want to say I'm going to dedicate this talk to all the punk rock kids in the room and the hardcore kids. I know there's a lot of you out there. That's what I like to see. Don't let the sweater and collar fool you. I'll see you in the pit. Don't worry about that. Especially the ones who travel. That's awesome. I appreciate that. Okay, let's talk about why people break the law for animals. This is going to be one reason that people break the law for animals. This is another reason that people break into factory farms to rescue animals. This will be a reason that people break into laboratories to rescue animals. And it was images like this that drove me to raid fur farms to save those animals. So anyway, please keep those images in mind, those images I just showed you. Please keep those in mind as I talk here today. I couldn't get those images out of my head if I tried. There has not been a moment since, I would say, 1995 that I've not been haunted by the things that I've seen with my own eyes, the things that you saw there. Images I've seen of things at factory farms, images of things I've seen in laboratories, images I've seen on fur farms. And I've done a lot of things in my life to get those images out of my head. I've gone to demonstrations, I've gone into factory farms. So I've done a lot of things to find some peace in this world, to get those images out of my head. I've, like I said, gone to videotape factory farms with videotape. I've to videotape the conditions inside. I've gone to protests, and I've even gone to prison. And I've done this because I care more about justice than I care about the law. And I care more about ending those things that you just saw than I care about living in a world harmoniously where we allow those things to happen. So I'm going to share something with you, and this is a moment that I knew I was going to go to prison. And this was not the moment that I was arrested by the FBI. The moment I knew I was going to go to prison was the moment that I realized that I had seen too much, and I was going to have to employ tactics that I knew quite possibly may land me in prison. And there was a moment, and I can point to that specific moment, and I'd like to do that here with you today. And this is a story I've only shared maybe 2 or 3 times in my life. And it's a story that's very difficult to tell, and it's a story that I haven't really been comfortable telling very much, but I'm going to share it with you right now. And I was involved in activism in Seattle at the time. This is going back a number of years. And I was involved in activism like I think a lot of us are, vegan outreach efforts. I was following the classic protest formula. I was going to protests. We'd protest outside the Health Sciences building at the University of Washington. Things I think a lot of us do. But everything changed one day. And everything changed for me the day that I found a laboratory in Seattle. Now, how many people here are aware that there are laboratories right here at the University of Michigan? Are people aware this is going on? Okay. Well, up until there was a time early in my activism where I didn't really know the scale of what was happening. Was not aware how much was going on in my area. Well, one night we found a laboratory. Now, this is a laboratory. We got the address from a trade publication, a biomedical trade publication. And one night we decided to go down to this laboratory just to look at it. We had no plans of anything. Well, that very first night we went down to that lab, we stumbled upon a way to get inside this laboratory. Now, the only way I can explain how we got inside this laboratory is that somehow in those days it seemed like every time we set our mind to get inside something, we got in. Every time we set our mind to something, we got in. The group of people I ran with at the time, if we put our mind to it, it was as good as done. And we went down to this lab and we told ourselves we were going to get inside this place, and that's exactly what we did. Now, if you want specifics as to how somebody gets inside a laboratory in the middle of the night, you're going to have to wait for the book. I'm not going to give that to you right now. But nonetheless, we had, in long story short, we had stumbled upon undetectable access inside this product testing laboratory in the middle of the night. Now, this is the kind of place, it's a classic product testing laboratory, a place that will do anything you pay them to do with any animal, with whatever product you're trying to get on the market for a price. Now, what we would do is we would go down to this place and we'd wait for we'd hide out in a parking lot behind this place. And we would wait for the last employee to leave at about 1 o'clock in the morning. And we'd post a lookout. We'd send 2 people inside this lab with radios and to see what was going on inside. Now, at the time, this was not reconnaissance for illegal activity. This was something that we just felt like we had an obligation to do. It was our obligation, as it is the obligation of everybody here, and it is our right to know what they're doing to animals and what kind of injustice is happening in our area. Now, I believe in something that I can't really explain, and I believe there's something kind of magical that happens when you put yourself outside of a place at midnight, outside of a laboratory, outside a factory farm. You just put yourself there in the middle of the night without any expectations, with a totally clear mind. In my experience, things just happen. And now, I'm not a spiritual man. I can't, there's some things I just can't explain, but I've seen it happen too many times. You go to a place in the middle of the night, you're going to find a door open, you're going to find a window unlocked, you're going to find any number of things. You're going to find a set of keys in the dumpster that night that's going to give you free access to the building. I've seen it happen way too many times to explain, and that's what happened there that night. I remember when I was part of the first group of people that went inside this building. And we got inside. I remember the first room that we came to had a freezer inside. And I opened up that freezer, and inside that freezer were several dozen, perhaps over 100 very large Ziploc bags with dead mice, rats, and guinea pigs inside. And there were hundreds, if not over 1,000 of these animals inside this freezer. The next room we came to, I opened the door, and there was a cage inside. You couldn't even really call it a cage. It was actually more like a crate. And there was a solitary pig inside this room. And this pig appeared to be undergoing some kind of skin treatment, some kind of skin irritancy test of some sort. And he had open lesions on his back. And I sat there and stared at this pig for a long time, and I realized for the first time that we'd actually stumbled upon something that was much bigger than we were prepared for. The very next room we came to was a room that was full of beagle puppies. There was a large bank of cages against the back of this very large room. And I remember we approached the cages, and the beagles would cower in the back of these cages. And they also had shaved spots on their backs, and they had some open sores. Researchers love beagles. They love beagles because of their disposition, because they don't fight back. The very next room we came to had several hundred guinea pigs in very small cages. Each one of these guinea pigs had a very grotesque head implant of some unknown purpose. We went inside this lab 7 different times during the course of the time that we had access to this place. And I remember the last night, my last stop, every single time before leaving this laboratory, my last stop was the freezer. Because the reason I stopped at that freezer is I wanted to confront myself with what I was allowing to happen every single day that I didn't do anything about this laboratory. Because every time I opened that freezer, I would see those same animals that I had just seen the previous visit dead in that freezer. And I would go home every single night from these visits feeling as culpable in the deaths of these animals as if I was the researchers, simply because I wasn't doing anything to stop it. But I can tell you, most of the time when I went home at night after these excursions, I would think of that pig. And I spent a lot of time in that room with that pig, just looking down at that pig. And I knew that just by being there in that laboratory, at 2 a.m., just by being there, I had made it further than most people will ever get. And I knew just by taking that risk, that was something, but I also knew it wasn't enough. And I knew it wasn't enough because I would stand in that room with that pig, and that pig would look up to me as if to say, why aren't you doing more to stop this? Why do you come here every night and then turn around and walk out and leave me here? And I would actually, every single time sometimes I would go inside this place by myself just to spend time with that pig. And that pig's condition would worsen every single time I'd go to that laboratory. And I still didn't know what they were doing, but I knew it was bad. And I knew the way that pig looked at me, there was something very, very horrible happening to that animal. Well, the fourth time I went inside this laboratory, I opened that door, and that pig's cage was empty. And I knew his time had come. And I can tell you, I didn't stop at that freezer on my way out of the lab that night. Now, there's a very unhappy ending for all the animals in that lab, and actually there's a very unhappy ending for the story in general. I was not able to save those animals. As much as I had decided after my first visit that I was going to do everything in my power to make sure that that business did not continue operating another single day, I was not able to save those animals. In the end, I think what happened is we had too many activists in Seattle that knew that we had access to this lab, that knew the access point, and unfortunately, I'll never know what happened, but somebody did something in that lab one night that tipped them off that we were going inside, and they sealed off that access point, and we were never able to get back inside that place. And years later, that lab moved out of state, and it actually continues its murderous work to this day. Now, I learned a lot of lessons from this experience, and the first lesson I learned is that you should never, ever, ever tell anybody anything they don't absolutely have to know. If you have sensitive information, you don't ever tell anybody that, whether it's a secret, something that, for whatever reason, if too many people know, it becomes obsolete, you don't ever share that information with anyone. And that is never more valuable than if you're in an interrogation room with a police officer. This is best applied to law enforcement. Someone told me once, nobody talks, everybody walks. And I always remember that. And unfortunately, we were a little more liberal in how we dispensed trust in those days, and ultimately, it quite possibly cost every single animal in that lab their lives. And I always remembered that from that experience that you never tell anybody anything they don't absolutely have to know. But I think the most important lesson I learned from this experience is that lives are on the line. And every single moment that we spend debating or planning for the day that never comes, lives are lost. So how do you get to that point where you're hiding out in the bushes behind a laboratory with night vision goggles that your friend stole from his uncle's hunting supply store? Or how do you get to the point where you're standing in the shower at 3 o'clock in the morning because you decided you were going to go and scale the wall behind the local slaughterhouse, and you landed in a vat of chicken blood when you came up on the other side? Well, I'll tell you how you do this. The first thing that got me to this point is that I decided I had to internalize the fact that there was suffering happening all around me. Not in the abstract sense, but in the very real flesh and blood sense. And the second reason I got to this point is that I had to confront the fact, and this is something I believe very strongly, and this is one of the main points of my talk, is I have to confront the fact that knowledge bears responsibility. And that by knowing something, you have an obligation to do something about it. And I think this realization came to me one day when I saw my first chicken slaughterhouse. And a friend of mine had told me that he had stumbled upon, when he missed the last bus back to the suburb where we lived outside Seattle, he had stumbled upon a chicken slaughterhouse in full operation. This is just east of downtown Seattle. This is on between two major streets that we drove down every single day. As it turns out, there was a very large chicken slaughterhouse in full operation. We would drive by this place all the time, had no idea what was going on. Well, I told him when he told me about this, I said, you have to take me there. I need to see this with my own eyes. So he took me down to this chicken slaughterhouse. And we stood on a crate in the alley behind this chicken slaughterhouse, and within a matter of 2 or 3 minutes, I saw several hundred chickens getting grabbed by their feet, hung up on this conveyor belt, and having their throats slit right in front of me. And we began to go down to this chicken slaughterhouse a couple times a week just to simply see what was going on at this place. And I remember what we found out is that they actually would park semi-trailers full of chickens across the street from the slaughterhouse. And before they opened for the day, they'd park them overnight. So we would go down to this empty lot where they'd park these trailers, and we would just spend time with these animals. We'd go down there, we'd talk to them. We would, there were these wire mesh cages that were stacked about 5 tiers high. And we would go down there if we had some food in our pocket, you know, Cliff Bars or something. We'd feed these birds, and we would just spend time with them. But there would always come a point where we knew that we had to leave because the slaughterhouse was about to open for the day. So we would, at that time, about 5 o'clock in the morning, we'd disappear, and we'd go down that same alley, and we'd stand on that same crate, and I'd look in that same window, and I would see those same birds that I just spent time with 20 to 30 minutes before, getting grabbed by their feet, hung up on this conveyor belt, and killed right in front of me. And I'll say this again, I would go home every single night from these excursions feeling as guilty in the deaths of those animals as if I was the one doing the killing, as if I was the owner of the slaughterhouse, simply because, again, I was not doing anything to stop it. And what was most significant about this for me is that what was happening to animals for the first time was no longer an abstraction. It was something that happened in my own neighborhood. And this was an entirely new mindset, the fact that there were animals all around us. The stuff that we read about in books like, you know, Animal Liberation, Diet for New America, this stuff was happening all around us. So me and my friends got together, and it was a very close-knit group of us, of activists at the time. We got together and we decided, we sat down with a very explicit goal one day that we were going to visit every single animal abuse facility in the entire western Washington region. Now, I can definitely say at the time, or now I can say that that was kind of an overly ambitious goal. Okay, we didn't realize the scale of what we were up against. But nonetheless, at the time, we decided we were going to go to every factory farm, every slaughterhouse, every laboratory, simply to see what they were doing to animals with our own eyes. And we began to go where the animals were. And when we began to do our research, we were absolutely shocked at what we found. I remember one of the first things we found, we had an address for a place. It told us there were 150 dogs in this building. It was a research laboratory. Well, we pulled up to this place, and it was adjacent to a hospital. And I remember pulling up to this place and seeing a house. It was, you know, it was a big house, but it was still a house. Well, I thought we had the wrong address. As it turns out, we go around the back of this building, put our ear to a vent that was right about at knee level, and you could hear dogs barking from the basement of this building. I remember another address we had. The information that we had dug up told us that there were 20,000 animals in this laboratory. Now, I expected to pull up to this place and see something the size of 2 or 3 Walmarts, you know, with the smokestacks billowing and a giant sign outside that said, you know, Animal Research Lab or something. Well, we pulled up to this place. It was buried in the back of an office park. It would look no different than any single dentist office you've ever been to in your life, and no bigger either. And they had 20,000 animals inside this building. And that's when I realized, and those early excursions forced me to realize that this stuff was happening all around me, and these people took great pains and went to great efforts to make sure that we didn't know where it was happening. Now, my challenge would go out to anybody to tell me what the appropriate response is in a situation like this, where you're standing outside of a lab, let's say, and you knew for a fact there was 150 dogs inside that building. Now, these are dogs that could just as easily be those animals that you know and you love and you care about at home, the ones you call companions or pets or what have you. What's the appropriate response in that situation? Is it to stand outside, you know, make a little sign that says, please stop killing animals, and hope one day, you know, these researchers will have some awakening of conscience and decide, okay, you know what we're doing is wrong and we're going to stop. Well, I don't think that's your obligation in that situation. I think your obligation is to do whatever is effective. And that is our only obligation to these animals, is to do what's effective. And I think our only obligation in a situation like that is to get those animals out of that place by any means necessary and ensure that place does not go on to do business another single day. And it's our obligation not to do what feels good and not to do what is fashionable, but what is effective. And that is always your obligation as an activist, no matter what movement you're coming from. Now, in this climate of where you have, do people realize that you have 10 billion animals killed in this country every single year? That's what we're up against right now. Well, when I got involved in activism, there was kind of this emerging consciousness that patience in that climate, where you had 10 billion animals killed every year, wasn't just virtuous, it was actually criminal. And there was a real energy in the air at the time, and it seemed like every single time we'd wake up in the morning and check our email, there would have been some new action that had happened the night before on behalf of animals, some new illegal action. And these were people that would go out in the middle of the night and by any means necessary would do whatever they could to save these animals. Now, these are actions anywhere on the spectrum of things that I think maybe were of questionable value or strategic value. Things like, you know, people would go to McDonald's, they'd break out the window, they'd spray paint "Meat is Murder" on the building. Things like that. All the way to the other end of the spectrum, you had things that I think were absolutely fantastic. You had one action in particular I remember that highlights this perfectly. It happened outside Seattle, where you had some activists go into a pig slaughterhouse in the middle of the night. Now, rather than burn the place down, which would have been great, but rather than burn the place down, rather than graffiti it or do some minor property damage, these activists went inside this building and simply rounded up every single tool in the entire building that was used to kill animals. They took every knife. They took the captive bull air rifle used to kill it. They took every tool in the building used to kill animals and simply removed it from the building. And I remember the communique that was issued the next day stated, the anonymous communique, stated that these activists had carried out this action to guarantee at least one blood-free day in the slaughterhouse. And I remember hearing about this action and first of all thinking, what a fantastic example of what just a few people can do with presumably just an hour of their time to have actual tangible results on the lives of animals. And the second thing I thought, more crucially, was these people had quite possibly accomplished more in just a couple hours of their time than I had in my 2 years as an activist, standing outside buildings, waving signs. And so we were very inspired by this momentum, my friends and I. And we committed ourselves to escalating our tactics a little bit. And we committed ourselves to going out and taking at night what daytime never brought for these animals, which was their freedom. And I remember I had just kind of an epiphany one day at a protest, and I looked around, and I remember thinking that, or realizing for the first time, there was actually one thing that's worse than doing nothing at all. And that's doing something that gives you the illusion of being effective. And I realized that myself and my friends have been guilty of exactly that. Now, that is not to say that standing outside of a building with a sign cannot be effective at times. I mean, there are certain industries where, or certain campaigns where the slightest bit of pressure can possibly cause them to cave. Okay, so that can be effective. But I felt like we were guilty of is we would go outside these places and there was no strategy to it. And I look back on my 2 years as an activist and realized that I did not have the saved life of a single animal to my credit, despite all the work that me and my friends have put into this. Now, I'm excluding the animals that I saved as a result of educating people about the benefits of a vegan diet. Okay, I stand by that 100%. I think at the end of the day, vegan outreach is one of the best things you can do for animals. And if you don't know about this, I encourage you to pick up some literature up here at the end of the talk. But the issue I had is that we would stand outside of laboratories. We stand outside all these places, and we simply weren't being effective, and we were not accomplishing anything for animals. We were very hard on ourselves. We went to great pains to assess every little the minutia of being an activist. How do we get more people to our demos? How do we do this, that, and the other thing? The only question we never asked ourselves was the most important question, which is, are we effective, or are we actually saving animals? And it was around this time I was having these realizations that I began to learn about the fur industry in Seattle. Now, the fur industry in Seattle's a hotbed for the fur industry. You can drive within about a 30-minute radius of downtown Seattle and come across about a half dozen fur farms. Now, these are places that raise mink for fur coats, obviously. And in Seattle, the farms will range anywhere from 5,000 mink up to 25,000 or more. And so when we learned about a new industry, me and my friends we did what we always did, is we'd simply go to these places. And I remember the first time we went to a fur farm, I'll never forget it. We pulled up to this place. It was a medium-sized fur farm in Granite Falls, Washington. And I remember pulling up to this place, and I remember thinking, first of all, this seemed a little bit too easy. It's almost too accessible. Excuse me, a little bit too accessible. We could simply hop the fence and have free run of the fur farm. Well, it turns out it wasn't that easy. We showed up, we hopped the fence, we began walking around the fur farm, and about 5 minutes later, a pickup truck comes screeching up. Two guys jump out, one of them had a shovel. They hopped the fence, they gave chase, they chased us off into the woods, and we got away. Well, undeterred, we went back to a nearby farm the very next night. And it was a repeat of the exact same scenario. We pulled up, hopped the fence, began walking around the farm. 2 minutes later, a pickup truck comes screeching up, guy jumps out, he chases us. We run off into the woods. Now, we couldn't figure out how they knew, it's 2 o'clock in the morning, how did they know that we were on their farm? Well, after some closer scrutiny, we realized that actually you could, most of these farms are actually, at least in the Northwest, I'm told it's not so much the case out this way, but in the Northwest, most of the farms have what are called photoelectric sensors that surround the farm, and they're these basically invisible beams that surround the perimeter of the farm. So if you break the beam, it sets off an alarm back at the farmer's house that alerts him to or her to your presence. Well, we realized very quickly, upon closer scrutiny, we could simply step over the fence, drop to the ground, roll under the beam, step up on the other side, and have free run of the farm. Now, the reason I mention this is to highlight the fact that every single time that we set our sights into getting inside of a building or farm, you name it, we always got in. Okay, these places are not as accessible as people think they are, not as, or they're way more accessible rather than people think they are. I don't care what you're talking about. I remember there was one laboratory in Seattle that was connected to a hospital, and they had animals in the basement of this place. Well, now they had stairways going down into the basement that were had doors that were alarmed, triple alarmed, deadbolted every which way you can imagine. The one thing they didn't think of is that this facility was connected to a hospital, and the emergency room of that hospital was open 24 hours a day. You could walk into the emergency room, hit the down button on that elevator, it would take you right down into those labs. So the point being, every time we told ourselves we were going to get in, we got in. And you know, we were probably less crafty than the average 19-year-old at that point. And I just want to highlight the fact that these places are not as impenetrable as people think they are. So we would go home from these excursions, and we'd see horrible things. I mean, factory farming, we'd see absolutely horrible things. And we'd go home and we'd try to just live our lives. We try to just put these images out of our head. But I can tell you there comes a point where you've seen too much and you simply can't forget. And I think we got to that point later that year when we learned about the pelting season. And this is a time in the fur industry where it's usually about a 3-week window where every single animal on every fur farm in the whole country is killed, skinned, and sent to the fur auction house. That's every mink, every chinchilla, every fox is killed during the pelting season every year, and they're shipped off. Now, this quite literally, man, I remember it was September at the time, and I remember learning this happens usually in late November, early December. And I remember thinking that quite literally meant that 2 months from that moment, there were going to be 2 million more dead animals than there were at that moment, and realizing that there was a tremendous burden on me to do something about it. Now, at that phase in our activism, I think that we had proven ourselves to be not quite capable of righting the wrong of, you know, a laboratory that had 3,000 animals inside, as I told you about that story earlier. But the one thing I felt like we could do something about that was within our skill level was a fur farm housing genetically wild animals. That was something we felt like we could do something about. And I remember very clearly sitting down in the lobby at the University of Washington in the Student Union building, just like this building, with a map of the Midwest and a list of fur farms, and mapping out what was going to be our attempt to get as many of those animals out of those fur farms as we could before pelting season. A friend of mine years ago told me, a friend of mine who will remain nameless, told me that breaking the law for animals for him was akin to, he likened it to touching a hot stove. He said, you don't have to think about pulling your hand away. He said, you just recoil. He says it's just a reflex response. No different than if you're walking past a burning building, you hear, you know, there's a child inside. You're not going to think, you're just going to act, and you're going to do what you can to rescue that child. And I think that captures very well why people do what they do when it comes to breaking the law for animals. So the very next day we got in a car and we started to drive eastbound. There's a fur farmer in Watertown, South Dakota. This guy's name is Turback. Well, he's not around, not with us anymore. He's dead. May he not rest in peace. But he killed every single year for the last 30 years up until 1997. That man killed with his own bare hands 5,000 animals every single November, going back 30 years. Well, that disgraceful individual woke up on the morning of October 14th, 97, and he found about half of his animals were missing. He found his fencing had been cut away of his farm, and 2,500 of his mink had been released. A few days later in Sioux City, Iowa, you had 5,000 mink and 100 fox released from a farm there. A few days after that, you had 1 mink released from another farm in Iowa. About 5 days later in, Tomahawk, Wisconsin, you had 800 mink released from a farm there. That same night, just about 20 miles away, you had 300 mink released from a farm there. And about 3 days after that, in Medford, Wisconsin, you had 3,000 mink released from a farm there. It was a 2-week period where you had 6 mink releases in about 12 days. And according to police reports, every single one of these raids followed the same model. There was no, there's no claim responsibility made. There was no graffiti left at the scene. The farmers just woke up in the morning and they found all of their animals, or most, if not all of their animals, gone. And when this 2-week period was over, there was somewhere between 8,000 and 12,000 mink and fox that had been released. And as a result of those actions, at least 2 of those farms had to close down forever. And I can tell you, anyone that's ever carried out these actions, or anyone who's ever been honest with you, or ever be honest with you, will tell you those are the kind of results that writing letters will never accomplish. Now, eventually I would be implicated in these raids. The government would spend about 7 years trying to hunt me down and make me a caged animal, just as those animals were. But I saw things during those 2 weeks that have haunted me to this day. And one of my worst memories is being at a farm. And this was a farm where we had discussed in advance that we knew there were so many animals at this farm, we were not going to be able to release every animal. There would come a point where we would simply look at each other, we'd say, okay, we just got to go, we got to get out of here. Because what happens when we release mink is they get very loud, they start to fight. The farmer's house was very close, and we decided there would be a point where we would just have to abort. So what that meant, quite literally, is that every single moment that we spent opening cages were lives that were going to be saved. And every moment that we spent doing anything other than opening cages, every moment that we stalled, were lives that were going to be lost. So I remember at some point, we were at this farm, we were opening cages, and I remember looking down at my shoe and seeing that my shoe was untied. And I remember thinking, okay, do I want to risk just continuing on with this and possibly, falling on my face, or do I want to, give the next 15 seconds of my life to tying my shoe? I had to make a choice at that point. Do I want to tie that shoe, or do I want to give, those 15 seconds to opening cages? And I knew that if I tied my shoe, there was that many fewer cages I was going to be able to open, and that was that many fewer lives I was going to be able to give a shot at freedom. And in the end, I decided to tie my shoe. And believe it or not, that's something I've actually thought about every single day since then. That's a burden I've had to carry for over 10 years now. Thinking that if I had just, instead of tying my shoe, open those cages, that's that many more mink that would have been saved. Now, this 2-week window of time I spoke of was part of a much larger campaign. Within a 3-year period in the mid-90s, you had something like, I think it was 50 or 60 mink farm raids around the country. And I remember the New York Times did a big article about this. It was a front page, above the fold story on this campaign. And it talked about how fur farmers are actually so on edge about animal liberators showing up in the middle of the night to raid their farms. They actually would sit up in their pickup trucks cradling shotguns, waiting for animal liberators to show up in the middle of the night. And the reason we chose this type of action was actually, it was very calculated. We chose this action because we quite simply determined that it was offered the best effort to yield ratio of anything that we could do for animals. We timed ourselves one time. It was 2 people. In 15 minutes, we were able to release 1,000 animals. Okay, now those are the kind of results you cannot get doing anything else. So in the center of all this activity, myself and another person were seen passing a fur farm in Sheboygan, Wisconsin. Now, just a little word from someone who's been there. One thing you definitely don't want to do in your lives is drive anywhere near a fur farm when 6 other fur farms have been raided within a very short proximity. Nonetheless, that was the mistake that we made, and only thing I can offer in my defense is we were very driven at the time. We knew the animals were short on time, and we simply felt like it was our obligation to do as much as we could before pelting season. So we put ourselves in a lot of risky situations, one of which was driving past this farm. Now, little did we know at the time, the FBI had actually put out, a bulletin across a 5-state region, alerting law enforcement as well as fur farmers to be on the lookout for a car that matched the description of our car. So we drove past this fur farm. The fur farmer noticed us. She gave chase, and within a matter of minutes, it was one of those scenes like in the movies, like where all the cop cars come screeching up and they have you surrounded. And they told us to get out of the car, and which we did. They told us they were going to search the car, which we told them, no, you're not. And they said, okay, well, they told us what they're going to do is impound our vehicle and go to a judge and apply for a search warrant. So would you believe they actually, after tracking down their 2 main suspects in this 2-week wave of mink releases that by some estimates it actually cost the fur industry over $1 million, they very politely asked us if we would just kindly turn ourselves in at the police department 24 hours later. Well, that was the date that we neglected to keep. And the eventual search of our vehicle, they turned up things like ski masks and fur farm addresses and the whole laundry list of things that might indicate we had something to do with these raids. That ultimately led to an indictment. And for over 7 years, I was considered a fugitive by the FBI. So let's get to the good stuff. Does anyone want to hear where I was during those 7 years? Is there anyone interested in that? Yeah. Yeah, you and the FBI both. So we're not gonna talk about that. But what I do want to talk about, and I feel obligated to mention this, is that I want to remind people that there are people out there right now that are being hunted by our government, just as I was, and there are people out there right now who are being sought by the FBI for actions ranging from burning down a horse slaughterhouse that never reopened to a sabotage action at a laboratory. And I just want to remind people that sometimes in fighting for a better world, we become the hunted just as those animals so often are the hunted. And that's what I was for 7 years. I was the hunted. So, I got arrested at Starbucks. Did you guys know that? Yeah, that's a true story. Yeah, you can go ahead and make your jokes, okay, because I've heard them all before. I got arrested at Starbucks. I think in activist circles there's kind of like a certain credibility deficit that comes from even being in a Starbucks, let alone being arrested at Starbucks. So as much support as I got in prison, I think there's a lot of people that never really got over the fact that I was the guy that got arrested at Starbucks. When I was in prison, I got a stack of letters this tall from people that are like, dude, you deserve 2 years just for being in a Starbucks. Oh my gosh. At the end of the day, I went before a judge, and I think you heard what I had to say to that judge. I pretty much told him to go fuck himself, is what happened. And he brought down his gavel. I got sentenced to 2 years in prison. But I remember my last thought before going to prison, they sent me back to my cell, and they said, pack up your stuff, you're going to go to prison any second now. I was in county jail. They said, we're going to ship you out to an actual prison, go back to your cell, pack up your stuff. And I remember going back to my cell, and pulling, for the first time, I started pulling out all of the police reports from all the various jurisdictions where they say that I released animals. And I began looking at the actual hard data, and I began looking at the number of animals they say I released. And I looked very closely at the police reports, and I began to subtract all of the animals they say were recaptured after these raids. And when I actually did the math, as it turns out, I was serving about 10 hours per animal that was never recaptured. And I had this tremendous sense of peace come over me. I remember thinking, I'm honored to be able to give so little to get so much. So why do people sacrifice their free time for animals? And there's a lot of people in this room that are doing exactly that. Why do people sacrifice their careers? Why do people sacrifice their freedom for animals? Well, for me, animal liberation is a very pragmatic decision. For me, I simply took an objective look at the cause of most suffering in this society and realized you have 10 billion animals killed every year in this country. And that's simply where the cause of the most suffering. And also, more importantly, it's where I feel I have the most ability to do something. I feel like the ability to do something about. Now, there are those people out there, and I know we know those people, that I think give people like maybe me a bad name, or people that don't extend their circle of compassion to everybody, or they care about animals because that's their thing, and they don't actually extend their compassion towards all of the oppressed. And I don't have any allegiance with those people. I stand on the side of the people that believe if a creature can suffer, then its life is worth fighting for. And I stand on the side of the people that believe in ending all injustice, not just for the master race or the master species, but for all. And I think our greatest obligation is to those in the greatest of need. Now, in my life, I could say that I have not been terribly motivated by the things I just read on a piece of paper. Or in my life, I haven't been terribly motivated, honestly, by the things I've been told. Or, frankly, even the people I've had around me. I can say more than anything in my life, I've been motivated by what I've seen with my own eyes. And I think that's always going to be that point of no return, is when you see what you're fighting for with your own eyes. Now, one thing I've noticed is that if a problem exists to you only on paper, and we all read literature, distribute literature, and we, wherever movement we're coming from, we all like to, outreach is always an important part of that. And that's absolutely fantastic. But one thing I noticed is that if a problem exists to you only on paper, generally your solutions are also going to exist only on paper. You're going to write letters on paper. You're going to make signs out of paper. You're going to write essays on paper. But in my experience, when the problem crosses over into that 3D realm, that's when your solutions are going to carry over into that realm as well. Which is why I think, and I say this all the time, I think it's absolutely crucial, is that I think one of the best investments you can make as an activist is to see what you're fighting for with your own eyes. Not just know about it in the abstract sense, but actually see it. And that was the best investment I ever made. And we would go to these places, we'd go to pig farms, we'd go to egg farms. I mean, one of the worst things you will ever see in your life is what happens on an egg farm. And I've been to at least a half dozen egg farms. And most of the time you can just walk in and you'll see 5 or 6 chickens, if not more, in a cage about half this size. So small they can't even lift a wing. And these are animals that spend most of their lives in darkness, and that's where your eggs come from. Or if you talk about a pig farm, pigs spend most of their lives in these little metal crates that can't even turn around. So, you know, if you eat animals, I would ask you to please ask yourself or confront yourself with the question, even if all you know is that little bit that I just told you, ask yourself how you can justify that. Because the responsibility of knowledge is to confront the obligations that come with it. And I had a friend recently, he was speaking, he told me a story a couple weeks ago. He was speaking at a university and on similar topics as to what I'm talking about. And someone raised their hand, and during the course of this talk my friend was talking about, he was making the comparison between what happens to animals and Nazi Germany. And someone raised their hand at the end of his talk, and rather than necessarily confront him about that analogy, they simply said, you know what, I don't believe for a second that you believe that what happens to animals on factory farms is as bad as what happened to you know, Jewish people in Nazi Germany. He said if you really believe that, you would be out there every single night burning down these places, burning down slaughterhouses until it ended. And you know what my friend's response was? He said he didn't have a response. He said there was no excuse for not doing exactly that. He said the situation was so bad, it warranted exactly that kind of behavior, but he simply had no response. And I would say the same thing. I would say there's no excuse for me getting up here talking about something when I should be out there doing it. There's no excuse for any of us sitting here hearing about something that's happening within 5 miles of us, if not, you know, 50 yards of us, when we should be out there doing something about it. There really is no excuse, and I think we're going to look back at ourselves one day, just as we look back on those citizens of Nazi Germany, and ask ourselves, why didn't we do more to stop it? So if you want to make that investment and see, you know, what's happening in your own neighborhood, it's a lot easier now than it's ever been, I can tell you that. When I got involved, you know how we found out where laboratories were? We would simply drive aimlessly through the suburbs, looking for any business name. We'd go through office parks and look for any business name that sounded like might be a little bit sketchy, like it was a pharmaceutical company. Something that had the word bio in the name or something. We'd find these places, we'd go around the back, we'd dig through their trash. We'd say, okay, is there animal bedding in the trash? What does the paperwork say? Just to get an idea about where they had animals. We'd go to slaughterhouses, we'd wait for them to drop off animals, and we'd follow those trucks back to the factory farms. And that's how we found out where factory farms were. Now, today, it's a joke. I mean, we live in the information age. We don't have the excuse of ignorance anymore. You can now go on websites like finalnail.com and get a complete list of every factory farm, or every slaughterhouse rather, every laboratory, every fur farm. This information is a lot more accessible now than it's ever been. I mean, when I got involved, one of the only ways we could find out what the hell was going on is just to walk through university hallways and jiggle doorknobs. I mean, that's how archaic it was. That's what we had to do, just to even find out what buildings had animals. It's a lot easier now. And I'm putting a website up, and it doesn't have a lot of content up right now. But if you want to go to voiceofthevoiceless.org, I put up a bunch of links where you can find out what's happening in your neighborhood. So if you want to know, please check that out. But the reason I do this, and the reason I encourage this so much, is that these industries, and this is actually true of all injustice, not just animal abusers, but these industries thrive on one thing, and that's out of sight, out of mind. And if you can take away that veil of secrecy, you go so far towards removing their power. And do me a favor, and we're at a big university, and when I'm at a big university, I like to mention this. Do something, when you're at a major university, something this size, where you know there's a lot of research going on. When you walk around this campus, take note of the buildings where it's a pretty safe bet they're going to have animals inside. Okay, psychology is always a safe bet. Anything involving you know, biomedical sciences, biomedical research, neuroscience. Okay, there's certain departments where it's a pretty safe bet they're doing animal research. Now, when you walk by one of those buildings, look up at the top. I didn't do this here, but this is true of almost every university I go to. Look up at the top of those buildings. What you're going to see most of the time between the top row of windows and the actual roof is a windowless gap of 1 or 2 or 3 floors. Okay, that's where they hide the animals. Now think about what that means for a second. There's actually secrecy built in to the design of these buildings. Okay, they're not worried about animal rights activists knowing what goes on in there. These buildings predate the animal rights movement. Okay, these people are worried about anybody knowing what goes on in these buildings. And it really shows you, in no uncertain terms, that these people knew from day one that what they do is sick and what they do is wrong. And I think everyone should carry that burden of being haunted. We all know who the Weather Underground is. I guess Bill Ayers is speaking here, actually. Okay, this is a group that carried out a series of political bombings, primarily in the 70s. They did a film about the Weather Underground. And I saw this film a while ago. And there's a quote from that film that really stuck out with me, and it's really appropriate to what I'm talking about. They asked one of these people, after they had carried out these bombings, they had gotten indicted, they went underground, they got arrested, went to prison, got out. After all this, they said, why did you go so far to try to change the world? Why did you go so far for what you believe in? And this person said, the reason they went this far is that there wasn't a single moment between the years of, whatever it was, 1962 and 1974. There wasn't one moment, whether they were making toast, whether they were walking their dog, whether they were taking a shower. There wasn't one moment they were not haunted by the images of what was happening to the people in Vietnam. And I think that captures so well what makes a good activist. It's not just, loading yourself up with a lot of data. It's something that happens on a very emotional level. And sometimes the only thing that can put those images out of your head is to go out between when the sun sets and the sun rises and do what you know has to be done. There's a real drive in that. I'll never forget one of the first times I went to, actually the first time I went to an egg farm. I remember walking into an egg farm. It was pitch black. We opened the shed door, walked in. I remember walking to the first cage I came to, and there was a chicken in this cage that was huddled in the corner. It had most of its feathers that had been pecked away by the other chickens. Wire mesh cage, just as I described, 5 or 6 chickens about this big. And I remember seeing this chicken, and it had its wing caught in the wire mesh. It was actually hung up. It couldn't get free its wing from this wire cage. And I remember just looking at this chicken, and I can tell you that every single animal I've ever seen in these really bad situations, in factory farms and laboratories, every animal I've seen, they all have the same look. It's this look of hopelessness. It's this very vacant look. It's as though they just lost their spark. And that's how this chicken looked. And I remember wedging its wing out from the wire mesh, and its wing just kind of flopped down. The chicken just stared at me, blinking. And I remember I had to leave that factory farm that night, and all 50,000 birds that were in that shed. I had to walk out of there. And I remember thinking there was no way that I could explain to those animals why I was just walking away without doing anything. There was no way I could explain to those animals that, there's a lot of selfish people out there that like to fry up their embryos every morning in a frying pan and eat them. There was no way I could explain to those animals how there simply weren't enough homes for us to house them all or rescue them all, or any of them for that matter. There was no way I could explain to them that every single person we went to in Seattle that we thought was down, that had a little bit of property where they could house chickens, slammed the door in our face because they told us, you know what, I don't want to go to prison for possession of stolen property. So they weren't willing to house these animals. There's nothing I could say to those chickens to make them understand. And on the subject of being haunted, I can tell you I saw a lot of those things on that 2-week road trip that ultimately led to prison that have haunted me to this day. And the most vivid memory I have is pulling up to a fur farm, and we had an address, and the information we had didn't tell us anything about this fur farm. All it told us was that this was a fur farm, and it had an address. It didn't tell us what animals were there. I remember pulling up to this place, and we walked about a mile to the end of a dirt road. Eventually, when we got to the end of this road, we came up over the apex of a grassy hill. And I remember looking down at what was a very large fur farm, but I knew right away there was something very different about this farm. I remember we looked down at this place, and I remember thinking, okay, the average mink cage is about this big. But we were looking down on some cages that were about this big. And it was a full moon. And I remember looking at the backlit silhouettes of some very, very large animals. And I didn't know what we were looking at. And I remember sitting there on that hill with my friend looking down at this farm. I remember 5 or 10 minutes passed while we tried to figure out what we were looking at. And then it hit me in a moment that we were looking down at more lynx. These are wild cats, large wild cats. We were looking down at more lynx in one place than existed in all of the wild in the entire western United States. Now, lynx are a threatened species, but you can still raise them for fur coats. So you talk about being haunted, that will definitely do it. How many people here have heard the term the green scare? Are we familiar? Have people heard this term? Okay, this has been getting just amount of media attention recently. Now, this is obviously an attempt to draw the analogy between the Red Scare of the 50s and the current repression of environmental activists and animal rights activists. Now, I think it's very relevant to discuss for this discussion to discuss the demonization of people that fight to make this world a better place. Now, rather than offering you some dry analysis, I think it's better to offer a little bit of my personal experiences. Being labeled, and I think we've all heard this term, labeled an eco-terrorist. And I realized right away when I got arrested that my case was not your average criminal case. They were not looking at me as the guy that simply opened the cages. I was the eco-terrorist to them. And I also realized right away this one little word, eco-terrorist, was going to have a tremendous effect on the conditions of my incarceration as well as the outcome of my legal case. Now, I don't think I need to tell anyone here that it's the fur farmers of the world that are the true terrorists. It's the researchers of the world that are the true terrorists. Activists are counter-terrorists. But nonetheless, let's talk about my experience. The first thing I noticed being labeled an eco-terrorist when I got arrested and having a politically charged case is an immediate attempt to determine every single person that I knew. And I realized right away, when you have politically charged cases, they become interested in knowing every single person that you know. And I realized, again, they were not prosecuting me. They weren't going after PeterYoung. They were going after an entire movement. And to them, I was their gateway to this movement. And I remember my lawyer pulling me out of my cell and taking me to the attorney booth one day. I'd been arrested for about 2 weeks. And I remember him scratching my head, saying, you're not going to believe this, but these people are absolutely obsessed with getting a complete list of every single person that you know. He began to tell me the stories about how they had raided, the FBI had raided, I think, 2 or 3 apartments around the Bay Area where I was arrested in California. They searched a storage unit, they impounded a vehicle, they subpoenaed phone records. And these were all people that they believed were somehow not necessarily guilty of any crimes, but people they just believed were affiliates of mine. These people were the FBI was so obsessive in getting a list of who my friends were, that actually, first of all, there's a lot of friends of mine that I go way back with that are afraid to talk to me to this day because they know the FBI is to this day very interested in who I know. Because they want to look back and look at the entire grid. They want to know how this person knows this person, and they want to sit back and see how the whole movement is interconnected. And that's a really great way for them to get a foothold in dismantling the movement. But when I got arrested, I had a backpack on me. And I think the FBI got their hands on this backpack when I got arrested. And I think every piece of lint in that backpack got shipped to some forensic lab somewhere. But one of the things they turned up in that backpack was a little fortune cookie-sized piece of paper. Now, a friend of mine, unbeknownst to me, had slipped this piece of paper in my backpack when I wasn't looking, and she had written a quote on it that she somehow thought would be of interest to me. It was a quote from the book, Catcher in the Rye. Now, she signed that quote on that piece of paper, Holden Caulfield. Well, the FBI became very interested in who this mystery friend of mine, Holden Caulfield, was. And they began to run Holden Caulfield through their databases. They did a criminal history check on Holden Caulfield. And when I got arrested, we got a 12-page document back that was their attempt to determine the identity of this Holden Caulfield. Now, never mind, this is the protagonist in the best-selling fiction book of all time, okay? But nonetheless, if you guys are interested, actually, they found Holden Caulfield. He lives in Tempe, Arizona. So there's actually some poor, unfortunately named old man in Tempe, Arizona that got a knock at his door saying, how do you know PeterYoung? What's your involvement in the animal rights movement? And so on and so on. The point being, it's very clear they were not looking, at that point, had been looking into evidence in 10-year-old mink releases. They just wanted more names for their list, and that was it. And the next thing I noticed, having a politically charged, quote-unquote, eco-terrorist case, is is the weight of that little word and how much weight that carries when you're arrested. Now, keep in mind the things I'm going to tell you now. Think of all the people that are in prison right now, and if you don't know who's in prison for similar actions, you can go to a website like ecoprisoners.org and get a complete list. There's a lot of people doing a lot of time right now, just for trying to make this world a better place. But the things that I'm going to talk about probably apply to most of those people tenfold, because things have gotten a little bit worse in recent years. But nonetheless, when I got arrested, I was being charged with 2 counts of a charge called animal enterprise terrorism. And I remember when I got arrested, they put me in a cell block they put me in solitary confinement immediately. They threw me in a cell block of what was considered to be 14 of the worst people in a jail of over 1,000 people. There were only 3 people in the cell block I was in that were not charged with murder. Okay, I was deemed to be that caliber of criminal. Now mind you, the only thing I'm charged with at this point is releasing animals from some people's backyards. Okay, that's it. But they don't look at it that way. I wasn't the guy that opened the cages, I was the eco-terrorist. And when they finally extradited me to Wisconsin, where I was actually charged, from California, they put me on an airplane, Con Air. I think we've all seen the movies or whatever. That actually exists, Con Air, and they put me on an airplane. It's a retired commercial airliner, and they put 100 guys, well, it's like 90 guys, 10 women, on this flight, and everyone's shackled at the hands and the feet, and they just basically drop people off at various prisons around the country. Well, what I found out when I got on this plane is that there's 1 or 2 people on every flight that's deemed to be so high risk that they have to have what's called a black box that goes over their hands. It's an extra safety precaution, so I don't know. So for inmates deemed to be violent. Well, so of course I'm the guy that gets the black box, and I remember sitting there on this airplane. There was a Hell's Angels bouncer on one side of me. I don't know what he's in for, and there's a guy who's in for kidnapping on my other side. And I remember one of them stands up and looked at me and was like, "What the fuck did you do?" And I was like, "Look, dude, all they did was open cages." And they're like, "Yeah, right, dude. What did you really do?" Believe it or not, and this continued when they finally brought me to Madison, Wisconsin, they threw me in a cell block, and I didn't know anything about the security level of where I was housed or anything. I'd never been to a Madison jail before. And they threw me in the cell block, and it was about 6 o'clock at night, and all the other prisoners were watching the evening news. So I said, all right, I'm going to try to assimilate as best I can, being like, well, white for one, but being like kind of weird too on second. And so I was like, all right, I'm going to sit down and talk to these people. So I was like, what's up, guys? And I sit down. They're all watching the news. The top story in the news that night was a man who had been, I think, just sentenced to like 12 years for actually raping women in a convalescent home. And I remember sitting there watching courtroom footage of this guy getting sentenced. And at some point I look over, and there's the guy sitting right next to me. So again, I was deemed to be this caliber of criminal. These are the people I was housed with. And believe it or not, this actually continues after prison. Now, what if I told you there was somebody that had been convicted of, name your heinous crime, rape, and got out of prison? If I told you that person was under surveillance 24 hours a day by the FBI, had all sorts of different very strange things happening, all kinds of bizarre types of attention from the authorities. Whether or not that was justified, you would probably think that sounds a little bit off. They would devote that many resources to somebody that was got out for anything really. But nonetheless, that's the kind of experience the person that gets out of prison for a politically charged crime can expect. When I got out of prison, within a matter of I think it was like 2 days after I got out of prison, I remember looking out of my window in the living room and seeing a white car parked outside. We found out there was nobody inside, but we found out very quickly there was a not so cleverly disguised video camera right on the dash that was aimed right at our front door, presumably just to see who came and went. And we used to stand on the porch of the house just looking at that car and just thinking, like, you know what, like, what if we just like went out there and just put a big sheet over the car? Like, what would they charge us with? I don't know. We found out recently they actually sent, when I got out of prison, some people threw like a little like welcome home, get out of prison party for me, and in Hollywood. And I remember we found out not too long ago that the FBI had actually sent an agent to this party, presumably just to see. I don't even know, like what kind of music eco-terrorists dance to. I have no idea. And believe it or not, there's actually, and I, not to sound too conspiratorial, but when I give talks, oftentimes there'll be usually somebody usually in the back row, so I'm watching all you. Somebody will raise their hand at the end and ask a question that is so clearly aimed at me, getting me to incriminate myself, that it's just absurd. I mean, people that are probably not there for the reasons that maybe everyone else in the audience is there for. You know, so if you're going to raise your hand and ask me like how to join the ALF or something, don't even try it because I'm totally on to you, okay? So let's talk about what the green scare is to me. And this is in very concrete terms what the green scare means to me on a very personal level. The green scare is to me having to talk to my ex-girlfriend recently and find out the FBI had went to her house a couple of months ago asking questions about me, a full year and a half since I got out of prison. The green scare is to me having to take the battery out of my cell phone every time I discuss anything, even as benign as a demonstration, because the FBI is now taking cell phones and remotely turning them into roving microphones that pick up any conversation within earshot. Do people know that they're doing this now? This is what the FBI is doing. Your cell phone is now effectively a microphone. Even turning the cell phone off does not disable its capabilities. The only thing you can do is actually take the battery out. The green scare to me is having to burn every single piece of paper in my house rather than throwing it in the trash because the garbage man comes to our door one morning at 6 o'clock in the morning and says, why is it that you guys will pull your trash cans out to the curb every Wednesday, but when we go to take the trash cans, empty them, there's nothing inside? And that's kind of staring at him blankly and then realizing, oh, well, that's because the FBI comes at 5 a.m. and takes all the trash and takes it back to HQ. And that's a true story. And the green scares to me, getting a phone call about 5 days ago, from some people in Salt Lake City where I've been living recently, having to hear that they just indicted 2 people from mink farm raids and they're charging them with animal enterprise terrorism, just as I was. And those people are in jail as we speak, facing long prison sentences for allegedly trying to make this world a better place. Now, in activist circles, there is something that I found is an unmentionable. It's something that we're not allowed to talk about. It's something that is, it's almost been blacklisted from conversation. And it's something that has a deterrent effect that eclipses everything else. It's something we keep in the closet and won't discuss. And that thing, I'm talking about is prison. Now, whether prison is a very direct threat to anyone in this room, or more than likely a very indirect threat to the people in this room, I don't care what movement you're coming from or what you represent, prison has always been a part of every social justice movement. Every time you start to become effective, they will start to put us in prison. So it is not something we can just cut out of the equation and tuck away and not discuss. And I think one of the best things we can do as a movement is to demystify prison. Now the fact is, as I said, it's actually a good sign when they start to put us in prison because it means they're scared and it means we're starting to become effective. Now, when you're absolutely certain in your sense of purpose and you're absolutely certain in the justness and necessity of your actions, consequences are always going to be an afterthought. And people are going to go to prison. People have gone to prison. There's people facing prison time now for animal liberation. There's people in prison right now for animal liberation. And it's very interesting to me to the extent to which prison consumes us as activists, especially in this post-9/11 climate we're in. And maybe it's just the people I run with, but I feel like there's this kind of this unspoken sentiment that we're all just going to go to prison one day. That if you have any original thoughts in this day and age, that we're all just going to go to prison. I hear people say this all the time. We're all going to prison one day. And I think we spend our whole activist careers, looking over our shoulders for this boogeyman that really never materializes. Now, although it is true we live in a very harsh climate right now, I just want to remind you of some hard facts. Now, this is, again, that's all this is. This is just math. This is not anything else. Not an attempt for me to steer the course of your activism. This is just the facts. There have been 1,000 Animal Liberation Front actions since 1979. Of those 1,000 actions, fewer than 30 have resulted in any actual arrests. And of those 30, only a very, very small handful have actually resulted in substantive prison time. Now, when you factor in the easily avoidable mistakes that people have made, myself more than anybody, when you factor all that in, it really actually results in prison being a statistically insignificant threat for anybody that chooses to cross legal lines for animals. There's a film called Behind the Mask. It's a great film. It's about the ALF, and it talks about, there's a quote in that film that I think is great. Somebody in that film points out that you actually have a better chance of getting killed in your car on the way to the grocery store than you do getting arrested for an action carried out on behalf of animals. Now that's something we do every day without even thinking about it. We will go drive to the grocery store. You have a better chance getting killed than actually saving animals. That's a fact. Now let's look at some more facts. It takes more skill to liberate a chicken from a factory farm than it does to go into a grocery store and shoplift a pack of gum. Okay, and I think we've all done that. Maybe not. Or we'll just say sneak into a movie. Now, I've been to a movie theater. Okay, there's people there that are paid to keep me from going inside that movie theater without paying. I've also been to a factory farm at midnight. There's nobody there to keep me from going inside. So, you know, do the math. I think, and you also, I'm going to call it, so I'll point this out. Do people still do, what do they call them, beer runs? Where you like go into like a convenience store and like steal a bunch of beer? Do people even do that anymore? No? Well, this point's going to be irrelevant then. But nonetheless, you got more chance of getting caught doing a beer run at a convenience store than you actually do emptying a mink farm. Okay, so but in that sense, we are all animal liberators. Maybe we just don't know it yet. People always ask me about prison. To what extent does having a politically charged case affect your treatment by other prisoners? And I can tell you that the way it actually ended up affecting me was much different than what I thought. When I got arrested, I had some assumptions about how people were going to react to the kind of case that I had. And when I got arrested, like I said, I was in solitary for 6 weeks. But when they finally pulled me out, they put me in jail in Oakland, California. They were on their way of shipping me out to Wisconsin. Now, please don't ever get arrested in Oakland. Okay, that is a bad, bad jail. Don't ever go there. I can't stress that enough, but nonetheless, that was my first exposure to convict culture. And I remember they pulled me out of the bus. It was like 2 o'clock in the morning. Pulled me off the bus, threw me in this holding cell. It was standing room only. There was like 50 guys in the room the size of your bathroom. They shoved me in the cell and closed the door behind me. And it was kind of like one of those scenes in like an Old West movie, you know, where the out-of-town stranger walks into the Old West saloon and everybody turns their head to look at the new guy. That's how it was. And there's about 10 seconds of silence. And finally somebody broke the silence and said, "What did this motherfucker do? Cheat on the SATs?" And I was like, oh my God. I was like, here we go. I was like, this is going to be the next 2 years of my life, 5 years, 10 years, I don't even know what. I assumed I was going to be subject to constant verbal harassment and who knows what else. But what they don't tell you is that that's county jail. Okay, that's an entirely different, not just a different living situation, but it's an entirely different culture than prison. Okay, and what they don't tell you is that the worst time you will ever do is that time you spend in county jail, in that place you go when you first get arrested. When you get sentenced, and you get sentenced to more than a year, they send you out to prison. Okay, totally different world. So nobody told me that at that point. Well, when I actually got to prison, I found something very interesting, an interesting facet about convict culture. I found there's actually a tremendous amount of respect that's extended towards people that are looked at for having stood up for their beliefs. Now, it doesn't matter if those beliefs conflict in every possible way with those of the other prisoners. All that matters is that you're looked at as being somebody that stands up for himself, or that you're looked at as being what they call a stand-up guy. Well, this manifested in some very interesting ways. You know, prison's not the kind of place where people are too, you know, emotionally, I don't know, they don't express themselves a whole lot. But I can tell you that people went out of their way to show me that they respected what I was in for. One of the things in particular that really stood out for me is I'm vegan. I've been vegan for 14 years, and I stayed vegan in prison. It was sometimes very difficult. And one of the only things I could do in prison sometimes to ward off scurvy was to there was 1 day a week in the dining hall where you go through with your tray and they give everyone an apple. Well, I would take these apples, I would hoard them, I would pull them out of the trash, I would get all the apples I could, and I'd ration them out throughout the week. I'd take them back to my cell. Well, every night after the dining hall, I'd go to the library and I'd read the paper or whatever. Well, on these apple days, every single night when I go back to my cell, I'd open my cell door, and right there on my bed would be 10, 15, 20 apples the other prisoners had very quietly rounded up and simply placed anonymously on my bed. And it was a very subtle gesture, but I think it spoke volumes. And I really learned something living amongst these people that we call criminals. And these are a lot of lessons, well, a couple lessons that I think can be applied to activism very, very aptly. One thing I was very impressed with, and actually more disappointed than impressed, but impressed with, was the extent to which people will do more for a little bit of money than you and I ever will to make this world a better place, or you and I ever will for animals. I was in prison with people that would exercise great ingenuity in their profit pursuits. I was in prison with hackers that would dress up like in these elaborate disguises, you know, like a pizza delivery man or what have you, simply to get access into these buildings where they wanted to confiscate documents they could use in their various hacking pursuits. I was in prison with jewel thieves that learned how to pick locks and cut glass and drop in through skylights on ropes to get access to jewels for a little bit of money. And I remember thinking, when have animal rights activists ever dropped in through a skylight? I mean, that's actually happened, but not enough. When have activists ever gone that far, in their campaigns? And it was actually very disappointing, as well as somewhat encouraging, that there's actually people willing to go that far for something. Unfortunately, it's too rarely activists, and that's why I don't look to other movements necessarily for advice or tactical advice or strategy. I look to people that achieve results, no matter who they are. There's a lot you can draw when you stop looking outside of just movements and actually simply look at people that achieve results, even if those results are much less noble than what you and I are fighting for. And the next and last lesson I learned from prison culture that I think is the most valuable that I'll share with you is that in prison, all that matters is what you do. What you say is absolutely of no value whatsoever. In prison, action is everything. Now, in prison, you don't walk up to a guy and talk trash to his face. You don't even talk trash behind his back. You either walk up to him and punch him in the face, stab him, throw him down a flight of stairs, or you don't do anything at all. You're either his best friend in the world, or you're beating him up in the shower. Okay, there's no middle ground, because there's no such thing as talk in prison. There's no such thing as boasting. There is only doing, and that's it, and that's all that prison culture respects, period. And I started thinking about all these, these quote-unquote radical subcultures that we create that are so long on words, they're so verbose, they're so long on printed output, and just talk, and patches and shirts and everything else, and so short on actual action, or so short on tangible results. I can tell you, I don't respect any culture where the authors are placed above, the saboteurs. Or I don't respect any culture where the speakers are in any way elevated above the people who are actually, the street soldiers in this fight. I'll take prison culture over this so-called radical culture that we've created any day. Because in prison culture, action is everything. Talk, it means absolutely nothing. And talk, very literally, means nothing. It only matters what you do. The animals don't care what you talk about. They don't care what your t-shirt says. All they care about is what you do. The reason I talk about prison, and I'll just end the prison talk on this. The reason I talk about prison is that more than anything, I want to point out that we have unlimited weapons at our disposal. As activists, we have a toolbox that is bottomless. Okay, there is no end to the tactics that we can employ to achieve our goals. Now the opposition, they only have one weapon. They've only got one thing they can use against us, and that's prison. That's it. That's all they've got. So when we demystify prison, we have one less thing that's standing between us and the world that we're fighting for. And I think that when you pull that curtain away, the most fierce threats of prison are oftentimes its most hollow. Now I can tell you, when you get to prison, especially if it's a federal prison, you're probably going to say what I said. You could end up in a bad prison, certainly. But more than likely, if you ever have to go to prison, you're going to say what I said. You're going to look around when you get there and say, this is it. This is what I've been afraid of. I think the most important message that I have to offer today, and you could apply this to any pursuit, is to ask yourself how you can fight smarter and not harder. They've got a rule in business, I think probably a lot of us have heard this, the 80-20 principle, that in business it would be like 80% of your profits come from 20% of your customers. Well, I think that's always going to be true of activism as well. 80% of our results are always going to come from 20% of our efforts, or 5% of our efforts, or 1% of our efforts. And we would do very well to ask ourselves what that 10 or 0.5 or 1% is, and focus on that. Now let me give you an example. Every year you have an animal rights conference, and this is great. It's an annual conference. It happens in DC and LA, alternating every year. And you have this conference. It's a great thing. I'm not at all trying to knock it. It's a great way for people, especially if you're just getting involved, to learn about the animal rights movement. But what you have every year is you have almost 1,000 people every single year that take time off work. They they book expensive plane tickets and book expensive hotel rooms and devote a lot of resources into going out to this conference. And that can be a great thing. But let me just point something out. If every single one of those people, rather than devote all those resources into going to this conference, if every single one of those people were to pair off and go to a fur farm that night and empty that fur farm, and the very next day go to another fur farm and empty that fur farm, and the very next day after that go to a slaughterhouse and take that slaughterhouse out, and the very next day go to a laboratory and break down its doors. By the end of about 10 days, you wouldn't need a animal rights conference the following year, because there would be no animal abuse industries to speak of. Okay? Now that is fighting smarter and not harder. If every person that ever held a vigil outside of a laboratory simply went to a laboratory and did everything in their power to dismantle it and put it out of commission, vigils will be obsolete. And we wouldn't be having this, direct action versus legal activism debate, because there wouldn't be a vivisection industry to speak of. Now, I've never heard of a struggle that's been won by putting flowers in a gun barrel. I know of a lot of battles that have been won with lockpicks and a good pair of gloves. Now, I can tell you, when we released mink from those farms, there was no amount of legal protest that would have saved those animals who were slated to have been killed 3 weeks later. When you had activists go into a laboratory at the University of Iowa and smash every piece of equipment on the 3rd floor and get 400 animals out of that laboratory, there was no amount of sign waving that would have accomplished that. And when you had activists go into a laboratory at Louisiana State University and destroy a inhalation toxicology laboratory and destroy equipment used to test various harmful substances on beagles, there was no amount of peaceful protest that would have accomplished that. That is fighting smarter and not just harder. And there are a few battles that will be won, with a very reasoned please and thank you. There's a lot more that are going to be won with claws and fangs. And I think that is our only obligation as animal rights activists, is to be the claws and fangs of those animals. They have the blood of 10 billion animals on their hands, okay? They've got the law on their side, but we have a few things as well. We've got the truth, we've got our dedication, we've got stealth, we've got the element of surprise, and we've got the power that comes from one person breaking free and saying, you know what, tonight this is going to end. Now, I certainly didn't want this. I didn't want to have to go to prison for this. I know the Shack 7 did not want to have to go to prison for posting the home addresses of animal researchers on the internet. Ended up doing up to 6 years in prison for that alone. I know that Jonathan Paul did not want to have to be sentenced to prison for 4 years for burning down a slaughterhouse, a horse slaughterhouse that never reopened. An action, by the way, since which the other 3 horse slaughterhouses in this country have also all closed down for various other reasons. So as a direct result of that man's actions, and the 4 years that he's spending in prison, there is now effectively no horse slaughtering industry in this country to speak of, okay? Now, I know he didn't want to have to go to prison to make that happen, but I can bet you anything he's more than proud to have done so. Nobody does this stuff because it's fun. Nobody goes into a factory farm and gets those animals out because it's fun. Nobody goes into a laboratory for the thrill. They do it because it's necessary and because it's just. So that's why I'm always going to support those that act outside the law so that others may know freedom. Now I'm going to leave you with one final point, and this may be the most important thing I have to offer. I want to talk about power, and the power that one person has. I gave a talk when I got out of prison. I got invited to give a talk at the University of Washington. Now, that's where I started my activism all those years ago. And I had not been back to Seattle since then. I had been considered a fugitive by the FBI, and I'd been a lot of places, but not Seattle. And I was looking at this as a grand homecoming. I was looking at this where, I was going to go show up at this talk, and all those activists that I'd spent time with all those years ago, those people that said, they were going to be into this to the day they died, They were all going to come out of the woodwork, and we were going to have this grand reunion. Well, let me tell you what happened when I went back to this talk at the University of Washington. There was not one person that showed up at that talk that I was active with all those years ago. And I began to do some probing, and I realized that all those people, again, that said they were going to be into this to the day they died, well, as it turns out, they put in there a couple years, and they felt like they could just simply, pay their dues and just move on. They could just go home. They could just become accountants or basket weavers or whatever the hell people do up there in Seattle, and just move on. Well, this was quite I guess it was something I never really wanted to admit, the fact that most people are not going to be into this till the day they died. And I would put the question to all of you, if this is not just something that, cool that you're into, something cool to do with your friends, if this is something you're into for the long haul, you have to ask yourself if you're properly fortified for the day that you wake up and there's no one standing by your side. Are you still going to be effective, or are you just going to cash in your chips like all the rest and say, well, if there's no one to work with, then I'm done? And I began to question something, and that is that blind faith that we have in strength in numbers. And I think that it is one of the most disempowering myths of our age, that this faith that we have in strength in numbers. Now, if we're going to need large numbers of people on our side to get the kind of cultural shift that's going to be necessary for us to actually create some real change. But concurrently with that, we need to ask ourselves how much power a single person has. We need to ask ourselves what we're going to do if we wake up for that day that I spoke of and everyone else is gone. Are you going to still be able to be effective, or are you going to realize that you invested all of your energy in this myth of strength in numbers? Now, that was something I did not question until later. How every single time I go to a new town, and I still hear this to this day, people say, you know what, I'd love to be more involved, but there's not enough people in the area. There's not enough groups active in the area. As we're all just sitting around, tapping our toe, waiting for this day, for this critical mass to build, all of a sudden then we can start to become effective. Now, let me tell you what they never tell you. They never tell you, and no one ever told me this, it only takes one person to go inside a factory farm with a video camera, document the conditions inside, create a little press release, and release that footage to the media and expose what these people are doing to animals. They never tell you it only takes one person to go to the employment office of a major university, apply for an animal tech position in a laboratory, document the conditions inside, and again, get that footage out there and expose what these people are doing. They're never going to tell you it only takes one person to go down to an overpass at rush hour with a banner, spray painted with whatever message you want, and drop that banner at rush hour and expose that message to thousands of people. When I was actually forced to be honest with myself, I began to look back, and I had to confront the fact that when I look back on those fur farms that I went to, there is no reason that every single person could not have emptied, or that one person could not have emptied every single one of those farms. And that is a power that one person has. So this is not an all or nothing fight. There can be a lot of victories on the way. I think that, at this point, I'm not so much invested in the idea of winning in my lifetime. It may not happen. What's most important is that I focus on leaving behind as many victories as I can. I would ask all of you to do the same. There can be a lot of victories along the way. Every animal you can deliver from a cage is a victory. Every animal you save by educating people about veganism, every one of those animals is a victory. So please remember those images I showed you. Don't ever stop being haunted by what you know. And don't just get upset about it. Get a little angry and then go out there and get active. And most importantly, fight for the lives of the oppressed as if they were your own. And that is all I got. So thank you, everybody, very much. I'm more than happy to open it up for discussion as well. I think we should do that. Open it up for discussion and/or questions. Yeah.
So when you were in court, did any of the other activists help you out with say getting a lawyer or?
Oh yeah, I had more support than I could ever have asked for. When I got arrested, throughout the whole duration of my prison sentence, I had more mail than I could answer, more books than I could read. I had more commissary money I could spend on food and I had more support than I ever could have asked for. More visit offers than I could accept. I mean, it was just tremendous amount of support. And I really like to kind of put that out there and let people know that if you do go down fighting for this stuff, you know, you will be supported. And I feel like that's the best way I can repay those people that supported me, is just to let those invisible people out there, nobody knows who they are, I know it's no one in this room, but those people that are out there that are still out there fighting for animals, you know, under darkness, let them know that if they go down fighting, they're going to be supported. So absolutely, I got, you know, my court dates were always packed. I mean, it would drive, I can tell you, it would drive the FBI fucking crazy when they come into the court and they show up right on time and there was simply nowhere for them to sit because the activists had filled every single chair. And at the prison I was at, it drove them crazy how much mail I got. They couldn't stand it because they want so badly, obviously, for us to feel like we're marginalized or people don't support us or they're cut off from the outside world. And they couldn't get away with it. I just had way too much support. So, yeah, I was very fortunate. Lawyers were paid for, everything. It was really, really wonderful. Yeah.
You said you had a book coming out?
I think you overheard a conversation you weren't supposed to overhear. A little bit earlier I was talking to him, but yeah, I mean, I'm laying the groundwork right now. It's certainly in the works. I don't want to put it out there too much because it may not happen in the next 6 months, but it's certainly, yeah, there's certainly more to the story that should be told, and that's my plan.
Do you have any books to recommend?
Books to recommend, oh my gosh. Well, you know, I think what set it off for me is a book called Diet for a New America by John Robbins. That book covers animal agriculture, from the environmental angle, the health angle, as well as the, what's the other angle I'm missing? It covers 3 parts.
Human
anyway.
rights.
Animal rights, obviously. The most, whatever. I missed the obvious one. So Diet for a New America is great. Animal liberation is a good, just like, you know, starter. There's a lot of books that I could recommend. I think, you know, what's really valuable for me is to read books from people coming from other struggles, particularly in other countries, and see that people are willing to risk their lives for what you and I won't even do 6 months in jail for. That's what's been really inspirational for me. I mean, you look, there is so little culture, such a little history or culture of struggle in this country. I mean, you can even look to other Western countries, you know, like Ireland or even the UK, where there's actually some like, I mean, in the US, we are very terrified by the thought of prison. There's simply not that cultural legacy there. And I think it's really unfortunate. So I think that's what leads to so much apathy in this country, is we're so pacified by the thought of prison. So read other books, you know, read whatever, Long Walk to Freedom by Nelson Mandela. Read books like that and just really take in that there are people willing to put their lives on the line for things that are much less important than other things that I'm not less important, but you know, important to them, but I'm just saying things that we could be fighting for in this country, in this cultural context. I saw another hand. Yeah.
What do you say to the people out there who think that doing direct action can be counterproductive to the long haul of consciousness and gives reactionary people ammunition?
Yeah, that's and there's a lot of those people out there. I would say to those people, you know, first of all, tell it to the animals. You know, those animals that are left in cages. And I would say, first of all, you know, I'm very pragmatic about my approach to breaking the law. I don't think it's just something I don't fetishize it by any stretch. I think that if you look at something like the meat industry right now, I think if I had to, you know, tactically assess it, I would say right now the meat industry in particular is so big, there's too much infrastructure there, that perhaps direct action is not going to be the best approach to dealing with the meat industry. Vegan outreach at this stage may perhaps be the best approach. Now that does not mean at all that I think there's not a place for it. It does not mean at all that I think that you know, slaughterhouses shouldn't all go up in ashes tomorrow. But tactically, if I had to admit that we simply don't have the numbers right now to make that happen, I would say vegan outreach is the best thing. But let's talk about something like the fur industry or vivisection. It's like, you know, who the hell is wearing fur in 2009? It's those, you know, little old ladies in downtown Chicago. I mean, we've taken outreach as far as it's going to go when it comes to something like fur. You know, now, historically speaking, this is the stage of things where, you know, direct action is best applied. So those weak links, where you know, industries that are kind of on their last leg, where you've taken outreach as far as it can go. We all have to admit there's a certain percentage of people that are never going to be reached. They're too soulless, they just don't care. And that's where direct action can be ushered in to finish off the job. Now, vivisection, people don't like to admit it, but that exists entirely outside the realm of public consent. Okay, this is like a closed loop of funding and people hiding behind white-walled laboratories, okay? Now, there's a certain amount of pressure that can come from getting footage out, and I think that's great. That's some of the best ammunition we have in vivisection is the footage that we've got through, well, one from ALF raids, but also from undercover work. So that's fantastic. But the fact is, these people simply don't care, and they don't have to care because they don't rely on us. They don't rely on consumer dollars most of the time. So I've never seen anything be effective, or I'll qualify that. I've seen very, very few things be effective with research, or even cause these people even to quiver just a little bit and question what they're doing, or clean up their act just a little bit that's legal. I think with something like vivisection, the only thing you can do is, to make ourselves a threat, is to, speak the language they understand, which is money, which is, protesting at their homes, which is, breaking down their doors, getting footage out. I mean, that's all these people are going to answer to, and they do have to be forced. So, point being, I take it on an industry by industry basis. But I can tell you now, although people love to say and just throw this about as though it's fact, that the media, is always bad media when it comes from direct action. People just aren't really looking at the facts. There was a mink release in Utah. It was like 3 months ago, and the media. I was following the media coverage around it. It was actually really bad. I mean, the media was just spouting, just regurgitating fur industry lies about all the animals were getting hit by cars. The animals don't survive in the wild. I mean, the whole laundry list. Well, I decided I was going to combat this. I sent out a press release. I said I'm going to offer $2,500 to the legal defense of anyone arrested for this action. And I did that just to stimulate some media interest because it was such an outrageous thing to say. And the media went fucking nuts for it. Sorry, I'm swearing a lot tonight, but the media went nuts for it. And I got an hour on the biggest talk radio station in Salt Lake City to talk about not just fur, but veganism and everything else. I had a reporter from the biggest news station in Salt Lake saying, why don't you come down to the studio and do an interview? And I said, oh no, why don't you meet me at a fur farm? I want to show these people what they're actually supporting. So we went down there, we did footage. He wouldn't actually go on the fur farm. I tried to bait him in, but he wasn't going for it. But we did a footage, we filmed an interview right in front of a fur farm. So stuff like that, I think, it's bad media because we let it be bad media. I mean, the fact is that people carrying out these actions cannot speak for themselves. They have to do it covertly, and they can't come out and say this is why we did it outside of a communique. So it's up to people like us to turn bad media and make it into good media. So I would encourage everybody, if you hear about something happening, don't just sit back and say, wow, this is terrible, this is bad media. Well, get out there and put yourself out there and make some fake credentials for yourself and put yourself out there. Send out a press release and say, this is who I am and this is why I support this. And we can get great media. I mean, I'll tell you, there's 2 examples in Seattle. I'll end with this. There's 2 examples in Seattle during my time there where footage from inside egg farms was shown as the top story on all the news stations in Seattle. Now that is priceless. People spend their whole activist careers trying to show millions of people on a broad level what's happening inside factory farms. The only way this footage got played is because people broke into these chicken farms. They took a small number of chickens, but they claimed it as an ALF action. They videotaped the conditions and they released it to the media, and you give millions of people their first glimpse inside a factory farm. That's great. I mean, that's fantastic. That's priceless. You could never pay for that kind of advertising. So, again, I will say there should be a better media component to ALF actions. There's not enough attention given to that. I think it is important, but when it is present, the media can be absolutely fantastic.
Would you say that on a college campus that animal activists become too visible, or when do they become too visible to do illegal actions in their area? Is there a point?
He's asking, just so everyone hears, at what point do you become too visible on a college campus to do illegal actions? Well, it's not my role at all even to get up here and tell anyone they should do illegal actions or anything else. If I had to objectively assess, I would say, in my experience, everybody in the world thinks they're too high profile. And it's always an excuse. I mean, everyone in the world says, I'm on a list somewhere, I can't do this or that, and it's always an excuse for inaction. The fact is, this big brother sort of world we live in is very overstated. The fact is, it's very easy to move anonymously. It took the FBI 7 years to find me. So a lot of good all-seeing Big Brother eye does when they can't even catch, like, a 19-year-old kid. So point being that it's very easy to move anonymously. It's very easy to move invisibly. With a little bit of care and precaution, I don't think, there's very few people I actually put in legitimately in the category of being too high profile. So I just think, people should confront themselves and ask themselves if that's just an excuse or that's something that they are very objectively assessed. And I don't know what the threshold is. I wouldn't even know what to say to that. If you're being followed by the FBI 24 hours a day, then you're too high profile. If you're not, then you're not.
Just out of curiosity, how do you feel about PETA?
PETA? Well, seeing as we have PETA employees in the audience, I'm not so likely to be. No, I think PETA is great. I think PETA is, I think they always come at it with the right approach, which is bottom line, what's best for the animals. I think PETA does a lot of great work. I've always defended PETA. PETA has not always been so nice to me, particularly when I went to their headquarters. They weren't very friendly, but outside of that, I think PETA does great work. I mean, they get a lot of media attention, and what they do well. I mean, their whole point is we're going to get media coverage for the animals, and they do it well. And you really can't argue with it. I mean, look at something like PETA 2. I mean, every 13-year-old girl in the world knows what PETA 2 is. That's great. So I think they do great work. Let's do, yes.
What was your reaction in the courtroom when you gave your statement of regret, as you would call it?
When I gave that statement to the court of my sentencing, there was, people applauded, and then the judge said, if you do that again, I'm going to throw you out, every one of you. And then people applauded again, and then he didn't throw them out. I heard that, when I walked in the courtroom that day, I remember looking out, and there was like 6 rows, and the last 5 rows were all activists. And the first row they reserved for fur farmers and FBI agents. And I remember my lawyer leaning over to at some point during the proceeding and saying, in his 20+ years as an attorney, he'd never seen so many FBI agents at one hearing. And the rest of the row was all fur farmers that had traveled from all around Wisconsin, and probably actually as far away as South Dakota, just to celebrate me going to prison. And there really was from that row, there was a very sort of festive vibe to it. These people were there to celebrate the fact that I was going to prison. And that's why I gave that statement that I gave. I walked in and I said, you know what, if these people are going to be there to hear me just grovel and regret, they're not going to hear from me. So that's why I said what I said. And I couldn't see, I wasn't allowed to turn around, but a friend of mine told me that she was actually sitting, directly behind the fur farmers. She said one lady, a fur farmer, buried her head in her hands and just left them there for several minutes. I don't know if that was like a sob or what that was, but so that's all I need to hear to make it worth it.
What was your family's reaction to everything?
Family's reaction is sad silence, I guess. It's not spoken of. The fact that I went to prison and was considered a fugitive for all those years is literally just surgically removed from my life story. They don't mention it. I come from a real middle-class family where like everything's okay. It's like everything's always okay in their world. So it's like everything's okay. Peter's in prison. Everything's okay. Everything's always okay. So it's just not spoken of at all. My mom told people when I was in prison, when they asked what her son did for a living, she said I was employed by the federal government. Which was true. I made 12 cents an hour, but it's totally true. Okay, anyway, thanks everybody. There's food, and I'm going to hang out for a little bit, so thanks for coming.